is, what does it say here? It has a really fancy altitude, hyperbaric environments, and microgravity, otherwise known as how the body affects or gets affected by exercising at altitude is pretty much what we're going on here. So all the different environmental characteristics, your body's response to it, and then how your body can acclimatize to it. We kind of mentioned this the other day, but we didn't go into a ton of detail on it. So then we'll do some altitude, some hyperbaric things, and then microgravity, like what happens when your body goes into 0G for too long. That was just fascinating, but there's only like 2 slides. So when it comes to exercising at altitude, there's the barometric pressure is about 760 milligrams of mercury at sea level. So that partial pressure is going to change depending on the altitude that you are at. Probably the easiest way to see this is, I love this picture. So in your lungs, this is how dense the air is when how close the molecules are together. The percentage of oxygen is going to be the same. It's still going to be 21% oxygen and however much nitrogen and others. But it's going to, let's say, the pressure at Mexico City, which is about, let's see, 2,200 meters. It's about 5,000 feet, a little above. I think it's a little higher than that. I don't remember. But the pressure is 585 milligrams of mercury. So that means the pressure of oxygen is going to go from 159 at sea level to 122 at a mile up approximately. So hyperbaria is when there's a reduced pressures of altitude, and that's going to result in hypoxia or hypoxemia. That's when there's not enough oxygen in your blood. It's the simple way of putting it. So a barometer here's a really old one I found on Facebook Marketplace. Somebody was selling one. They said it was 5 feet long. So I was like, I don't know how this was there. I just thought it was cool. English mahogany steel engraved stick barometer, $10,000. Maybe this was on eBay. That might have been an eBay one. But either way, somebody was selling this thing for 10 grand. Now they can pretty much calculate it on your Apple phone or your Apple Watch, but it's not the actual meter. So they do still have the real meters like that. It would not surprise me that we have one around here somewhere in the science department, or maybe up at the observation tower up there in the back 40 where you do astronomy class. It's probably around somewhere. So here's just a couple of things that go along with this here. Started in 1644, someone developed the mercury barometer. And then somebody 4 years later demonstrated there's a reduced pressure at high altitudes. And let's see, so-and-so described oxygen and other gases contributed to the pressure of that barometer. And partial pressures. And then in the 1800s, that's where they started kind of coming up with the hypoxia that the body actually recognizes. Whenever we kind of say altitude, we're really meaning somewhere between this low altitude to 2,000 meters, which is about a mile. So you would say like between sea level and Denver. Denver, Colorado is the mile-high city. That's why they call it that. And there's some places that are higher than that in the United States and lower than that, but that's just kind of give you the basics there. Doesn't really affect your well-being, as in you can live there and it's not going to bother you. But your performances may be lowered as you do that. Has anybody ever lived at sea level and then gone like hiking in the mountains? Oh man, it is. I did that when we were in Lodi. Lodi's pretty close to sea level. It's within a couple hundred feet of sea level. And we drove like 2.5 hours. I don't even know where we went. We went to some mountain they had snow on that mountain. So, I mean, we went from 70 plus degrees, shorts and short sleeves in Lodi. Drove 2.5 hours on a Saturday with my cousins and went hiking. And I'm like dying. Like, I don't remember it being this difficult to hike in the mountains before. But I had been living for 3 years at sea level. And like, wow, what a difference that makes. Anybody know what altitude we're at here? Pretty close. 1,800. I believe the airport says 1840. It actually has it painted right on top of it. on the runway, it says 1840. I was like, man, we were 4 feet from that being like the perfect Adventist airport. Anyways, thank you. I was like, they couldn't have built the airfield up 4 feet. There's enough dirt around. So moderate altitude would be 2,000 to 3,000 feet. This is where when you move there, it's hard to breathe when you first get there. So if you like drive up to the mountains and it's above 5,000 feet, you're like, why is it so hard to just like walk across the room? Well, you're not getting as much oxygen in your body. Keep it moving. High altitude is going to be 3,000 to 5,000 meters. So this is where you could start getting some mountain sickness. And we'll go into those details later. Your performances is definitely going to go down. And it's not necessarily going to be restored by acclimatization. And then your extremely high ones are going to be above 5,500. So that's where we're talking 17,000 feet. I have climbed Long's Peak in Colorado, and I believe that was 1,400. So 14,000 feet. It's like 14,509 or something. I have a picture of me next to the plaque of the highest point, which is really weird because it was like this big flat top area like a football, and then there's this one rock that's the highest point. I'm like, that was anticlimactic. But, so for our purposes, anything when we say altitude, we're going to say that's above 1,500 meters, so about 4,000 feet. So I just give you an approximation, 4,000, 4,500. So the pressure at sea level, kind of already mentioned this, would be 760. If you climbed Mount Everest, the highest point in the world, it's about 250. So it goes down by about 2/3. So that's why if you want to climb Mount Everest, you're going to be wearing an oxygen tank and a mask because you can't breathe that air and be able to keep moving. So as we say it's always going to have the same amount of oxygen, and we're going to keep on going since we already mentioned that. So these are kind of those numbers there. It's tough. It's not that bad to see. So at sea level, Denver is 1,600 meters. So there's 1 mile. So my calculations were a little off. Mexico City is at about 7,000. And Pikes Peak, I think that's the highest one in Colorado. I think that's one I thought I climbed Long's Peak. But anyways. And then Everest is there. So there's all the different numbers. Here's how much oxygen you're going to be getting as it gets lower and lower and lower. And also the temperature out. So if it's 60 degrees in Miami, Denver is going to be 12 degrees less. And so as you get higher and higher, the temperature is going to get lower and lower and lower. Also, that's why your airplanes are all pressurized. Because if it wasn't pressurized and you were trying to fly, it would be very difficult to breathe. So air temperature, decreases about 1 centigrade or Celsius per 150 meters. This can also contribute to a lot of cold weather related disorders, which we would have talked about last time had we gotten that far in it. Humidity also is going to be a big change there. The higher you get, the less air or less moist the air is going to be. And that also could make you dehydrate a lot faster. So as you hike up a mountainside, keeping hydrated, all those reasons that you would dehydrate are all going to be the same there. Also, the higher you get, I don't know if any of you guys, do you guys burn easier when you go to a higher elevation? I'm blonde. I burn everywhere, so it doesn't really matter. My wife has, and I think my son, thank God, has the same skin. My wife barely burns. She will burn and then go to sleep and wake up the next morning and tanned. I'm like, you're not there. I have 2 colors, white and red. Those are the only colors my body knows. I do not tan. But my wife, she loved working in Arizona because we were at about 4,000 feet in Prescott, Arizona. Everybody, oh man. And the same thing. So in Phoenix, it's like 120 degrees. You're almost sea level in the middle of a valley, so the heat never leaves. And you would drive 2 hours to Prescott, Arizona, where the camp was. And it was like 2 hours away and 30 degrees cooler. So if it was 120 in Phoenix, it was 90 in Prescott. So like we would leave at the beginning of the summer, you'd be like needing jackets because at night it'd be like 70 in Arizona at night. but it'd be minus 20, it'd be 50 degrees in Prescott. So I'm like, man, I need a jacket. And all of a sudden, like, I don't wear a jacket the entire year in Phoenix. And all of a sudden I go to camp and I'm like, wow, I'm cold. But my wife's skin, she loved tanning up there. Like, she loved working at that pool because she would get the best tan of any place because she was closer to the sun. I didn't tan. So say the radiation is going to be a little higher. The rays travel through less atmosphere. Also, if you ever go skiing, anybody like to ski here? Nobody likes to ski? I've skied twice. That's all I've ever done. I've gone on 2 school trips for ski day when I was at Lodi. And I've never gone since. I would love to. I just never had the chance. But yeah, if you go snow skiing, remembering to put sunscreen on your face, because the sun is going to reflect off of the snow, and it's actually going to make it even brighter because you're, one, closer to the sun. It's being amplified off of all those snowflakes from all different directions, and your face is going to burn. I love seeing students when they come back from ski day because they'll have their big goggle spots, and then they'll red from here to here. It just cracks me up because they always forget. So when we talk to you about, so here's all the acute things. So this is what happens when you go from sea level to go hiking or when you go skiing. So, or if you, we also had a team that we would play that was close to Yosemite when I was in Lodi. And so when you went up there, you climbed about 2,000, 3,000 feet to get to like the edge of Yosemite, one of those cities just outside of it. It was always hard for our players, one, because you had to go across this crazy curvy road, and so I'd have kids that were car sick when we got up there. But also they just couldn't breathe as well. Like for some reason, we always played terrible in this gym, and this is probably why. So when you arrive at that game or skiing or whatever, your pulmonary ventilation immediately goes up, as in you start breathing more because you're trying to accumulate for the fact that there's less oxygen getting into your body. So your amount of percentage of oxygen stimulates the chemoreceptors in the aortic arch and carotid. Tidal volume, the amount of blood being pumped, goes up for several hours, possibly even days when you get there. So your ventilation is going to go up. Also could be a little bit of hyperventilation going on there, and your alveolus are going to be letting go of less carbon dioxide. So you're going to have a little less in there. So you'll be blowing off carbon dioxide and all this alkalosis. Sometimes there's just stupid words I can't pronounce. So your respiratory alkalosis is high blood pressure pH. So your blood is going to become more acidic because you're holding on to more things there. So the oxyhemoglobin, oxygen in the blood, is going to be going more up on the left side there. So this is going to prevent further hypoxia and driven by hyperventilation because you're breathing more when you get up there. Your kidneys are going to start excreting more bicarbonate, trying to reverse that alkalosis that's going on because the blood pH goes up. Pulmonary diffusion is going to, at rest, is probably not going to limit too much there. But once you get to altitude, so the alveolars are going to be taking more oxygen, so they're going to try to hold on to it more, which is going to cause a little bit of hypoxia. Your oxygen transport is going to be going down because there's less oxygen in the blood because you're not getting as much from the air. Take a standing break. Whew. Getting up at 5:15 for basketball. Are you a golfer too? I miss golfing. Huh? I want to go. Dude, I got a hole-in-one on December 31st, 1999. I was 14, right before everybody was afraid Y2K was happening. I was like, well, if the world ends today, at least I got a hole-in-one. I've never gotten one since. It was dumb luck. I bladed an 8-iron on a 114-yard hole. I was 14. That was a terrible shot. All right, so here's all the chemistry that's going on here. We kind of already talked about this one here. We're at sea level. The pressure's here, so you have 159 milligrams of mercury of oxygen go into the bloodstream. sorry, goes in, goes out, comes back with 100 into the blood or from the lungs, goes out there about 100 here, about 40 are going to go into your muscles, and then 40 is going to come back. Well, if you start with less, so if you're at 4,000 meters, so 10,000 feet of it-ish, I'm being very general with my numbers there to try to relate there. So if you're at 10,000 feet, it's 460 milligrams of mercury, and where you're really getting into it, so instead of 100 milligrams of mercury coming out through the arteries and going to your muscles, is actually going to be 42. That's a lot less oxygen going to your muscles. So your chances of cramping are going to go up. Your athletic performance is going to go down. The place you see it the most, though, is going to be in like endurance events. So if you're going running at a place where it's cold and up in the mountains and you're not used to it, you're going to really, really struggle. So it's like the pressure or diffusion gradient goes from 100 minus 40 to 42 minus 27. That's a lot less going on there. So here's what happens to your, this looks like the pressure. So at dry ambient air, you're just going to have humidification. I think we did this one in another figure before, very similar. But if we're starting a lot lower, it's going to get lower at 5,000 feet. So you can just see it, big time change there every time. So the air in your trachea, the alveoli, the capillaries, the blood vessels, the tissues, and then the venous blood pressure, way less. Same concept here. So the percentage of oxygen, how fast it's going to go out here. So the red would be at a lower temperature, or the lower pressures, higher pressures. Heart rates, so your oxygen consumption at sea level, this is where we're saying that your heart's going to have to work harder. So at, sea level, you're going to have that's 85. To get the same amount of oxygen into your body is going to be at over 100. I was noticing when I was hiking that day in California, we went from Lodi to someplace to hike, my heart rate was at like 140 to 180 the whole time. And darn my cousins, they are, well, one of them, he road bikes like 30 miles a couple times a week. Loves his road bikes. And they're over there. They're hiking the fastest hike I have ever been on. And not that my wife and I are not in okay enough shape, but these guys are just like, they're all 6'5" plus, long legs. I'm 6'3" and got long legs too, but I'm just not used to the altitude there. And it's just like, I know that could be closer, but something's not right. Same concept over here. Here's the pulmonary ventilation. So this is how fast they're breathing, breaths per minute. So this looks like they keep going there. So sea level would be fairly easy, but it goes up real fast at 15,000 feet. I've climbed a couple of 14s, 14,000 heights, and especially the higher you get, the quicker you're going to be breathing. Some other short-term altitude things. So the gas exchange in the muscles, I kind of already showed a graph about that. The location of the gradient is also going to change. The pressure in the muscles is going to lower your exercise capacity, is kind of what all that's saying. Pretty much said all those numbers in a picture a little bit ago. So here's some of the interesting one. In your blood makes some interesting changes when you get to wherever you're going to exercise that's in the thing there. So your plasma volume that we were saying, once you start exercising, you get more plasma. Well, when you get to a new place and you're just starting to exercise, your plasma volume actually goes down within a couple hours. Some of that's going to be just because it's going to be drier air the higher you are. So you probably just breathe part of it out. Your urine production is going to go up. So if you ever go hiking someplace, you're all of a sudden like, wow, I need to use the restroom. And you've only been there for like 20 minutes. This is part of the reason, is your body's actually getting rid of some of that plasma volume so that you can have a short-term increase in the percentage of blood that's going to be pumping through your body. So this is one of those short-term things that your body is going to do. so that you can get more oxygen to your body and get more oxygen just around. So the red blood cells will go up. So after you've lived there for a couple of weeks, that's more of a chronic thing. So temporarily the blood volume goes down, but it also signals to your bone marrow here. Yep. Signals to the bone marrow and says, you need to create more red blood cells because we need more oxygen. The body, we. So the long term, your hematocrit's actually going to go up, which is also part of what blood doping is, basically right there. Your cardiac output is going to go up despite the fact that plasma and stroke volume have gone down. So at rest and submaximal exercise is where this is going to work the most. It doesn't actually help your max at all. The more oxygen delivered to the tissues per minute, just because the heart's having to work harder to get more oxygen. So after a few days, the oxygen or the muscles will actually extract more oxygen. So your AVO2 difference there is going to go up, and it's going to hopefully then reduce the demand for cardiac output so that your heart doesn't have to work as hard. So those are kind of the longer term things there, but these are still short term exposures there. So in short, stroke volume is going to go, or the blood volume is going to go down because of your stroke volume, and your heart rate's going to go down as you get more exposed to it, and that pressure gradient and all that's going to kind of go down. So your basal metabolic rate, so this is going to be some of those hormones there that are in your throat. So your thyroxine secretions is going to go up. Your catecholamiine secretions are going to go up. You're going to want to eat more food, so you're going to be hungrier quicker when you're at altitude. And so your reliance on glucose rather than fat, so more carbs are going to be used quicker. So your anaerobic metabolism is going to go up, your lactate's going to go up, but that can reverse itself in those couple of weeks as you're going there. So there's no explanation for this. Like, they aren't 100% sure why that happens. It just does. And there's kind of a whole thing, and this is all be things that happen during submaximal exercise. So I'll give you just a second to read that. That's pretty much all we're doing there. Basketball practice, making my voice. Yeah. Having to yell over another practice of bouncing basketballs because there's two practices at the same time. They learned quicker than I expected. I'm on coffee number 3. And if my son takes a nap, I'm taking a nap. All right, so kind of already mentioned this. You're going to get dehydrated quicker. So you're going to need 3 to 5 liters of fluids more. Most of that's going to be from sweating, but you're just dehydration, and it's dry. Your appetite actually is going to decline even though you need to eat more. So paired with an increased metabolism to try to keep up with everything, your heart rate being higher, your ventilation being higher, so your metabolism is going to be increased. You're probably going to need about 500 calories a day. Athletes, climber education about eating at altitude. So if you actually take a climbing course, hopefully they're talking about that. Or if you have an athlete or a client that's going to go climbing, you need to talk to them about making sure they eat enough. Also, when you go, at least when I've gone skiing, I finish and I'm starving when I'm done. Like all the adrenaline from skiing, woohoo, woohoo. And then we stop for lunch and I'm like, wow, I'm hungry. And this is why. Oh, you need more iron to support all that, and more blood cells that your body's going to try to produce. So when your exercise and sport performance, so generally speaking, your VO2 max is going to be lower just because of the altitude, but it has to be past 1,500 meters, not feet. So like where we're at shouldn't make that much difference. And then atmospheric pressure's down, arterial pressure goes down, 8 to 11% drop per 1,000 meters, so per 3,000 feet. So if you were going from Lodi to over 3,000 feet, That's when my players had problems. It was those 2 games up near that we always struggled at. So the Mount Everest study was done in 1981. So this is the highest point in the world. The VO2 max went from 62 to 15 milliliters. So that means if at sea level, to be less than 50 milliliters, climbing is not possible without extra oxygen, was what they said. So basically, that study is the reason you need to have an oxygen mask and an oxygen tank to be able to get to the highest point. And yeah, we've pretty much already said that. The pressure compared to altitude. So there's what people's VO2 maxes would be in those areas there. And that'll make a little more sense when you have your own VO2 max number there. We'll make that make more sense. So aerobic exercise performance affects most by hypoxic conditions at altitude, so not enough oxygen. Your VO2 max goes down as a percentage of your sea level VO2 max. So you should have, yeah, that's basic there. Whoop, whoop. And one thing we're going to do is the perceived amount of effort. So when you're taking your VO2 max test, you're going to say, I feel like I'm working between 6 and 20. I'm at about a 10, I'm at 11, I'm at 12. Well, when they do the same VO2 max test at higher sea level, their perceived level of exertion is higher, is what that's saying. Your anaerobic performance is, oddly enough, unaffected. So if you're trying to do like 100 to 400 meter track sprints, your ATP PCR system and your anaerobic glycolytic metabolism don't use a lot of oxygen, so it would make sense that if you're not using oxygen to create energy, that part's not going to affect your athletic performance. It's the endurance things that are going to be going longer. It would be playing a soccer game, a basketball game, volleyball games, when you got to go longer and longer and longer. I would think volleyball would be a little less affected by it. My team's always played terrible at those, but I think that's because most of my girls got car sick in the bus more than the altitude. But that's because you're doing like quick sprint and then breathe again, quick sprint. I would think football is similar, that at least at the start it wouldn't, but you're going to taper off at the end. If you go 5 sets, you're probably going to have a harder time the longer the sets go. But if you can win it in 3, you're probably going to be better off. That would be my experience of at least seeing my athletes play. One more standing break. How am I doing on time? Not that good. I can't even see how many slides I have. Let me go first. All right, so we talked about the short-term things. So this would be your chronic exposure. So if you moved there and lived at altitude, so let's say you moved to Denver, Colorado, and so this is the things that would happen to your body as you live there. So your performance improves may never match the same as they were at sea level. So if you're running the mile, you may never get the same speed that you got at sea level. So your pulmonary, cardiovascular, and skeletal will have some changes. It takes about 3 weeks at moderate altitude. So 1 additional week for every 600 meters. And if you move back down, 1 month at sea level and your body goes back to normal, where it was. So it's pretty fascinating how quick your body can adapt. A couple of weeks this way, a couple of weeks going lower. So this would be all the different numbers there. So at sea level would be on the left, days, weeks, months. So this would be their heart rate. So at sea level, their resting heart rate would be 60. Few days into it, their resting heart rate is going to be close to 80. It's pretty high. And then it's going to keep going down as they adapt. Oh, this would be submax or at rest, and this would be at max exercise. So heart rate at max at sea level. They quit a lot, 10 heartbeats less. And that's something you'll get at the VO2 max test, what your max heart rate was. Stroke volumes. Yeah, interesting stuff there. Moving along. So your pulmonary adaptations, lungs. So higher ventilation at rest and during submaximal exercise. Your resting ventilation rate is going to be 40% higher than at sea level. And this is where we're talking that over 4,000 feet or 4,500 feet. Your submax rate is going to be 50% higher. Your blood's going to have more EPO. Oh, that's a hormone that's going to release for a couple of days. It's going to stimulate your red blood cell count to go up, which we kind of already talked about. Your elevated red blood cell count will last for 3+ months. So consequences of that long term, your hematocrit level will be about 45%. So that's because we were saying earlier you lose plasma right when you get to it. So your hematocrit at 4,500 meters, so 12,000 feet probably, 60%. So that hemoglobin is going to go up in proportion to the elevation. So the higher you are, the more red blood cells are going to be stimulated to try to make up for that. Hemoglobin curve may or may not shift. Your plasma volume goes down, but later it is going to go back up. So like your body's going to immediately be like, we need to get more oxygen to the rest of the body. So we're going to get rid of this plasma so that we can have more percentage of red blood cells being pumped through the body. But eventually that plasma is actually going to increase because your muscles and body are going to get better. Your heart's going to start pumping more as it adapts in those 2 to 3 weeks there. So you're going to have a more efficient heart living at altitude. This is where that really gets back to. Hemoglobin concentration compared to altitude. So this would be Denver, Colorado. This would be Mexico City. This would be the highest one. I believe I remember there's a city, the highest city that actually exists is at 12,000 feet. Don't remember where that is, though. So your muscle functions and structures will have a little bit of changes. So the cross-sectional areas is actually going to decrease. But your capillaries are going to stay there. So since there's going to be less cross-sectional areas, the capillaries are going to still have as many. So they're going to have less area, but the same amount of capillaries. So the density per area of the muscle is going to go up. Your muscle mass, though, could go down due to weight loss and possibly protein wasting. And people get lazy and tired. And they just mountain sickness. You just want to lay down and sleep all the time. So muscle metabolic potentials, the mitochondria's function and glycolic enzymes go down. The oxidation capacity of those muscles' metabolic potential, possibilities of making ATP go down. So some interesting studies on runners show that there were no major cardiovascular adaptations after 2 months at altitude. I think that's because the runners were more tolerant to the hypoxia. So this would be like a marathon runner, long distance runners. Tragic that our 2 runners aren't even here today. I thought that was Wednesday. Okay. So no major changes in aerobic capacity. So some possible causes to that could be that the reduced atmospheric pressure is inhibited by high-intensity training. Let's have a Woo! Forgot to delete that one. I had somebody miss last year, and I tried recording it through PowerPoint, and it doesn't work as well. So altitude training. I am running low on time. Yep. So here's the big question. What is the best way to train? Should you train at high altitudes and then compete at low? Should you train at high altitudes and then compete at high levels? Should you train at low altitudes, compete at high? Or should you live at high altitudes, train at low altitudes, and then compete at high? Because your opponent is probably not living at high altitude. It would be the last one, just because we're running low on time. Because your bodies are going to have all those chronic adaptations that we talked about. But when you go down to low you can train at low level. So your body's going to have all the adaptations. So you're going to be able to have more hematocrit in your body to pump more oxygen. Your heart's going to be stronger and used to pumping a higher stroke volume compared to the person that you're going against. But what you really want is then for you train at low, and then your opponent then comes and has to compete at high altitude. So their body's going to go through all the high altitude adaptations that you're already used to. So you want to train high, go down to sea level to train, and then hopefully make your opponent have to come adapt as well. So it's just another home court advantage. Oddly enough, the Olympic training areas in Colorado Springs, it's about 4,500 feet. I looked it up earlier today. Well, but their point is you train there, and then they should actually then go somewhere else to train and then come back up and live there. So they want them to live at high altitudes and then go train someplace. It used to be thought when they built the place in the 80s or something like that, that they wanted you to train high and then compete at high altitudes, and that would make it so your body was better trained. Ended up not being as good as they had hoped it would be, but now that it's already there, they haven't moved it, as far as I know. I remember walking around there, and they told me that Apollo Antoine Ono walked right by us, but nobody knew who he was at that point. He was just this little 5 foot tall guy that just kind of walked by with his hood over because he didn't want anyone to know who he was. They told me he walked right by us, but I didn't see him. So hypoxia at altitude prevents high-intensity aerobic training. So living and training at high leads to dehydration, low blood volume, and low muscle mass. Altitude training for sea level performance so far hasn't been validated. That might have changed. I don't know. That might be an interesting journal, but I don't think we have any more journals left. So there's the biggest value is going to be living high and training at low. Is the only one that they've really studied and figured out, yes, that really is the best way to do it. So another one, these collegiate runners. So when they live at 8,200 feet, they trained at 4,100 feet. The control group lived and trained at the 4,100 feet. They had increased hemoglobin, increased VO2 max, and that was correlated between a bunch of them. There was no change in the control at 4,000 feet. But some studies couldn't replicate. So that's just kind of where they think it's going. They're not 100% sure. It hasn't been validated by multiple studies yet. Oh, that was an interesting one. So this would be a studying at one of the universities where they had them in here in a treadmill. So they were training in a pressurized room. So these are the things that were controlling the oxygen, the nitrogen, and so the different pressures. And then the guy would sit here and he was studying these runners. And these were the two heights that they had them training at inside of this chamber. So it's just an interesting way of doing that. So it's like you don't have to actually live there. You can create an artificial high-pressure area. In another video, I saw an entire gym that was pressurized to have them train at different pressures. So a couple strategies for training sea-level athletes who sometimes have to compete at altitude. My Lodi kids. So compete as soon as possible after getting to that altitude. So it was always an advantage to have the first game. And ours changed depending on when we were playing them. Like early in the year, the guys played first, and later in the year, the girls played first. So if you played a team the first time, they just alternated it. So you wanted to be the team that got to compete first, because there's going to be no benefits for that acclimatization. If you want to get there early, so like your Olympic athletes are going to train at that same height that the Olympics are going to be at. And they're going to train there probably for 2 weeks to try to be able to have the best. And this would be most of those long distance runners, kind of things there. Living high, training low is probably the best of both worlds. Going to have passive acclimatization to altitude, but your training intensity is not going to be compromised by that low pressures. So they've tested it on 5K time trials. So living high, training high had no improvement. Living low, training low had no improvement. But living high, training low had actual improvement. And that's been, at least multiple studies have gotten it so far. So that might have changed. I think there's a new version of this book coming out next year. So living high, training low would mean like living at 2,500 meters. So that was that 81, 82. Training at 4,500, 4,100. Pre and post testing, the aerobic performance went up 1% and their VO2 max performance went up 3%. Sounds like a small number, but when you take an elite athlete, 1 and 3% is a pretty big number. So a couple other additional evidences here. How am I doing on time? Woo, gotta move. So here's the college men versus elite men and women. So this would be their improvement in race times. Don't have time for that. Oh, still not enough time. This one was really fascinating, that these short races times, they were worried that between Tokyo and Mexico City, just because of the change in pressure, that's the reason the numbers went down. But as we said earlier, your short speed stuff like 100, 200 meters, 400 meters shouldn't change, but the 800 meter had a pretty big change. So this would be like the world record times. You can do some artificial altitude trainings. There's these weird masks. I don't really recommend them. But people would say, I'm going to purposely breathe with this mask on that's going to limit how much oxygen I get so that I can train. But they haven't found any major improvements. The best thing is train high, low, and then low. Already kind of talked about that. Very quickly, in my last 2 minutes here, some of the sicknesses you need to be watching out for. So short-term mountain sickness will happen in the first 6 hours to 48 hours and can be really severe. So headache, nausea, dyspepsia, insomnia, possibly is developed into more lethal things when you actually get hypoxia and they're going to pass out basically. Pretty wide variance on, depending on your altitude, how fast you go up is going to be another one. So between that ratio there's a higher incidence of in females than males. So interesting there. Prevalence of altitude sickness, depending on how fast, slow ascent, fast ascent, rate of high altitude. I forgot I had it earlier. Oh, I wish I had enough time to watch that.
This week on EM&5.
I might make you watch that later. We'll see. So low end ventilation, headaches are the first thing. So if you or a friend starts having a headache and you've just climbed a mountain or driven up the mountainside, that's probably the first thing to know. If it continues to throb, worse in the mornings or after exercise, that's where you get really worried about. If they can't sleep at night, the way to help them would be a gradual ascent up rather than going straight up there. There are some things that you can give them. Hyperbaric oxygen rescue bags. Breathe into a brown paper bag. There we are. High altitude threatening to this. Pulmonary edema, cerebral edema. Pulmonary edema would be extra fluid in the lungs. Cerebral edema would be in your brain. So those are two that you really don't want. Those can be life-threatening. So that's what we were saying about headaches. It would be that cerebral edema. If they have a headache they can't get over. Oh, don't have time. So you have to be really careful when you go from deep temperatures. They always have to slow down on the way up when you go underwater. That's the hyperbaric stuff, so that you don't pass out in the shallow waters. Blood pooling. So this is all the responses. Don't be, when you go scuba diving is really where this is going to hit you. Breath hold diving. Scuba diving. Oh, yeah. Anybody been scuba diving? Oh, you lucky. I've never been able to go scuba diving. I would love to. Decompression sickness is what you worry about when you're going from super deep to coming back up. Give me a couple more seconds here. Oh, my goodness. I had such good videos to do. Oh, this was the microgravity thing where your butt muscles are going to atrophy due to protein synthesis. You lose your muscles. This would be all on astronauts up there. Last little bit here. Yep. So when you enter microgravity, all the blood goes to your brain. Prolonged, your muscles, everything's going to go back because you're used to gravity pulling it down. So your body's going to push all the blood back up to the brain. And that's all we got.